Okay, the book of Ruth. So the theory here was that we were going to think about the status of women and particularly daughters in the Bible. So somebody help me out. Let's just do a little, this is called metacognition, by the way, in case you're really curious about pedagogical theory. Let's just do a little remembering. What were we talking about? This is 2 Sundays ago. We were looking about things like bride price and dowries. What was all that about? Do you remember? What did it sort of tell us about being a daughter in antiquity? Okay, that there's a way in which you could be interpreted as property. All right, what else?
Protection of family legacy or lineage.
Yeah, that you have a role in extending the lineage of the family, but also that there's some protection for the daughter, that these are structures that are set up to protect daughters. Okay, what else? What else do you
Didn't have a lot of power.
Not a whole lot of power, right?
Had a little sometimes.
Little bit, right? You see little bits in places where there are women exerting power. The narrative sometimes covers that over, but if you kind of tunnel down through the narrative, you can sometimes see they're taking for granted that women are exerting some kinds of authority. Yeah.
You had the right to have children, and that was your first.
Yeah, it's not just that you had an obligation to produce children, that was the meaning of your life, but you also had a right. You had a right to be able to make a family. And so if the family's not doing right by you, if the husband dies and his father doesn't provide you with a new spouse, you have a right to walk out, right? There are certain obligations that the family has to you as well. Okay. Anything else you remember? Okay. Then the second week, we moved into some interesting texts, right? Women negotiating for themselves, women making demands on the family. So we looked at Tamar. We thought about what I don't like to call the daughters of Zelophehad. You remember the 5 daughters who have Klingon names, or Klingons have their names. What were we doing with that stuff? And the one about when a man sells his daughter into slavery. Remember how that one starts? Okay, what were we doing with that stuff? Who are the daughters of Zelophehad? We don't spend that much time mucking around in numbers, right? This one kind of jumps out.
Zelophehad doesn't have any sons, so they inherit from him.
Yeah, Zelophehad doesn't have sons. Now, this is a story. Remember, you always have to ask, when was it set? Or when did it happen? When was it written down? Right? You have to think about these as 2 different contexts because you're accomplishing 2 different things. So it's not totally clear that this is a historical story, right? Like this might not be something that happened. This might be a story that was told later and then set in the period before the conquest, set in the period before you cross the Jordan and come into the promised land. And so Zelophehad's daughters are worried about something. What are they worried about? He doesn't have sons, he's died. What's the big worry?
Worried about the inheritances. Yeah. Passing those land and valuables.
Yeah, what happens to the inheritance? When they come into the promised land, will he just get written out of Israel's history? Will what should have gone to him, will that just go to his brothers and it will be as though he never existed? And so they negotiate with Moses, who ends up having to ask God, well, what do I do about this, right? All the way to the Supreme Court is what that means. They negotiate to set case law that establishes if somebody dies guiltlessly, they are entitled to have their family name continue. And so the daughters have negotiated that. But then there's some pushback, because if they can marry whomever they choose, and they marry into a different tribe, then the wealth of the tribe they're from goes to a different tribe. Now, what's the problem with that? Say again?
Loss of power
Loss of power.
for the tribe they're from.
The tribe they're from definitely worry about loss of power. But if it gets to the Supreme Court, it means there's a bigger concern than just like this tribe wanting to hold on to its stuff. It means there's a principle at stake, right? And when I say gets to the Supreme Court, I mean, that is what we're looking at here. We're looking at a legal system built up on case law. And when something they've not anticipated happens, like it's not in the Constitution would be the 10 Commandments. When it's not in the Constitution, you go through a system of appeals until you establish a principle that will govern future disputes. It's exactly how our legal system works. And there's a reason our legal system works that way, right? Okay, so if it gets all the way to God, then that means there's something more at stake than this tribe wants to hold on to its power. What's at stake?
God's chosen.
All 12 tribes are God's chosen, so all, you would still get, like, Israel itself's not gonna get smaller, you're just gonna get a redistribution.
Part of the tribe's identity. Part of the tribe's identity.
It's part of the tribe's identity.
They all live in this place. And if it goes to somebody else, the land is over here, and then, it's all some weird patchwork.
Yeah, you would get some weird blending of the tribes, so there could be some dispute going on here about what is 12 and what is 1. So under united monarchy, I mean, you definitely want to emphasize the unity of the 12 tribes, but there's also this memory of the tribal confederacy from before that we're still thinking of ourselves as primarily 12, and we just cooperate on some things. We've got some tensions like that in the US, right? Between states' rights versus a kind of federal approach to thinking about what does it mean to be a citizen. But think about it, it's also about concentrations of wealth. One of the things they're concerned about is to keep an even distribution of wealth. So there's a whole tradition of the Jubilee year. Remember the Jubilee? The idea is that everything goes back to the way it was. Just like that never happened. It's a historical fiction. It was intended not to actually say what did happen or would happen, but to say, in an ideal world, the way we should govern ourselves is so that we do not permit concentrations of wealth. Why are they so worried about concentrations of wealth?
It's the war and fighting. You got mine, that's mine. It's power. Right? It's just power.
It's about power. It's about who holds that power, whose voice counts. It's definitely about war. Pretty much every revolution begins with an unsustainable concentration of wealth, where the tiniest percentage at the top of the pyramid hold the vast majority of resources. It won't take long, you get a kind of reverse pyramid. It's not going to take long where the masses at the bottom with insufficient resources are simply not going to cooperate with the system anymore. So part of what they're thinking about is a combination of justice and social order. You can't maintain social order with a vast disparity with concentrations of wealth. And so what they're thinking about is, how do we set up a principle that ensures that we have a relative, you're always going to have the rich, you're always going to have the poor. The question is, how much space is there between the rich and the poor, right? How big is that gap? The bigger the gap is, the less justice you have in any given society. By the way, we economists have a measure for that called the Genie Coefficient. I don't know how to calculate it. I barely know how to pronounce it, but I find that really interesting. Okay, so what you can see is that in Israel's history, this would have been something they were thinking about in the pre-exilic period. It's definitely something they were rethinking in the exilic period. They're trying to figure out, like, what kind of people are we? And what kind of people we are gets connected to stories about daughters in really interesting ways. Because if you never had a generation without even mixes of sons and daughters for any given tribe, then you wouldn't have to ask this question. Because they're living in a patriarchal society, and so they're assuming that distribution of resources will happen patrilineally. So if you're going to upset the economic apple cart, it's going to happen through a gender dynamic. And that, I think, is a really interesting question for us. When we reflect on our own situation, to what degree do concentrations of wealth follow from questions about gender equality, right? If you've ever paid attention to the way global economic development works, very often at the micro level, the focus is on empowering women economically. So micro loans to women in India, right? Economic development with girls in Africa. A lot of times what you're looking at is the way in which you relatively equalize gender differences leads to relatively equalizing economic differences. And I don't know why it is that way, but you can look all the way back into the Hebrew Bible and find that there is this really interesting tension between gender equality and economic equality. But what they're definitely trying to avoid is economic concentrations of power. In the pre-biblical period, so before Israel is on the scene, before anything in the Bible is written, before any of the characters in the Bible are set in a historical context, way, way back in the midst of history, is the crumbling of the Hittite Empire. So the Hittites ruled the region where it's basically the stage that the entire biblical narrative is set upon. And the Hittite Empire fell precisely because of an enormous disparity between the wealthiest and the poorest. After the Hittite Empire fell, there was a vacuum of power, and so there's chaos in the region. And in that chaos in the region, you start getting different power players on the scene, including a group of Habiru, outsiders. You get this disenfranchised group who doesn't have a kind of social claim. Those outsiders, Hebrews, kind of become the people out of whom these stories are told. And so even when Israel becomes a national power, even when they've got their own economic elites, somewhere in the background, they're always remembering that ours is a story of the outsiders, that ours is the story of the people who weren't wanted, who didn't have a place in society. So when they think about principles, they're thinking about how do we create structures that make sure there aren't outsiders. So you make sure that the daughters are protected even when they're sold into slavery, right? You make sure that the alien in your midst has a place, has some protections, that there's a place for immigrants, that there's a place for refugees, right? That those are kind of central themes. And then economic justice, that you make sure that there is this mechanism for correcting vast disparities economically, right? So when we look at the Hebrew Bible, not in this class, right? But there's a kind of temptation among Christians to imagine that the Hebrew Bible is like the bad stuff and the New Testament is the good stuff. But what you really see is that Jesus' economic preaching, last shall be first, first shall be last, mountains brought down, valleys raised up, all of that stuff is deeply Jewish. All of Jesus' economic teaching is connected to this root commitment in the Hebrew Bible to the idea that everyone deserves at least like a decent standard of living. You're going to have wealthy, you're going to have poor, but the poor have a floor, and you can't let them fall below that floor. That reframes what it means when Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you. right? Yes, you'll always have the poor with you. How do you care for them? What are your obligations toward them? It wasn't permission to be like, well, there's nothing we can do about that, so we'll just go about our economic merry way. Okay, that's a lot of threads, right? We've got daughters, we've got concentrations of power, and my goodness, now we've got the Hittites rolling around in the back of our minds. So let's come to the book of Ruth and see, this is a fascinating moment here where everything comes together, because now we're thinking about lots of outsider status. We're thinking about a family without sons. We're thinking about immigrants / refugees. We're thinking about economic equality, and all of that stuff comes together in a singular story, the book of Ruth. So when you go into the bookstore, well, when we used to have bookstores, right? Like a library. When you go to the library, you remember this metaphor? There's the fiction section, the nonfiction. If you're in the nonfiction section, are you in economics? Are you in history? If you're in the fiction section, are you in fairy tales? Are you in like historical dramas? Which section of the bookstore are you in the book of Ruth?
Is it the wisdom?
Oh, is it wisdom literature? Not exactly, but I can see where you're going with that. It's definitely kind of this reflective quality about it. Okay.
Biographical. Biographical.
Biographical. It's a story of a particular family. In fact, it's set up as the ancestor of King David. Okay. What else? What kind of literature is this?
Well, when you look at the New Revised Standard, it sticks out, it's, do not leave me or turn away from me. It looks like there are bits of poetry around which the book was written.
Yes. Looks like there are some bits of poetry here, right? Okay. Look at the opening line. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. What does the opening suggest? History.
Fables.
Fable.
Historical fiction.
Historical. Why historical fiction?
Well, I mean, is this a story? As I was reading, I kept thinking, is this a story to prove a point? Or is this based on some real events? Or,
Yeah.
I just kept thinking of your statement many years ago teaching that in the stories of the Bible, they had to be good storytellers to get their point.
Yeah.
And so were they telling this story in order to make the points? Based on real people, but.
Yeah. Are these real people? Did this happen? How much is it fictionalized? Did it happen at all? Right? Those are the kinds of questions you want to ask. And remember that to be true, a thing doesn't have to be factual. Right? So when Jesus tells parables, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, the question is not, was there some actual guy going on the road to Jericho? The question is like, what's the point of the story he's telling? So in a way, what we're trying to figure out is, how much is this fictionalized? And does it matter how much of it is historical? So when you look at those opening lines, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah. There are some cues there that tell you what kind of literature this is. Imagine that it said, 5 years after Othniel came to power, a man named, give us his name, lived, right? That sounds a little different, doesn't it? Or like in Amos, when it says, 2 years after the earthquake. We don't know which earthquake and everything, but it's clear that it's referring to something that people in that time actually remembered. But in the days when the judges ruled, that's kind of a long time. Well, I mean, can you be more specific? Which judge? Like sometimes my students will say, back in the day. And I'm like, which day? Right? Like, can you be more specific than that? Okay. A certain man of Bethlehem in Judah. Now, you care about Bethlehem in Judah during the period in which this is written, not because of Jesus. Jesus hasn't happened yet, right? Why do you care about Bethlehem and Judah?
Because that's where King David is from.
That's where David's from, right? That's where David's from. So you are hearing that, like Christians hear this and they're like, oh, Bethlehem, that's Jesus. No, David, right? That's David. Okay, so what you're hearing is once upon a time in the land where King David came from, famine. Okay, now they go to Moab, and you've got some associations with Moab. This might be too much of a reach.
Moab are the bad guys.
Moabites are the bad guys. In fact, you've got some jokes about the Moabites because they came from that daughter who seduced her father, right? That Lot, it's after the destruction of Sodom. Lot's daughters seduce him. They have kids. Their kids become the Moabites. And so this is kind of like a your mama wore combat boots kind of joke. So these are people from the area of David who go to the your mama wore combat boots area, right? Those are not us, it's the other side of the river. Okay, so there's a famine and you leave, because that's what you do. That's all over the Hebrew Bible, right? I mean, you can remember twice Abraham took Sarah and left because of a famine. Both times he pretends that she's his sister, not wife. That whole thing is weird. That's a story for another day. Okay, so the man, Elimelech, and his wife, Naomi, I like that she has a name, and his sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Good thing when you're looking for biblical names for kids, you might want to think about Chilion, that's a pretty good one. And they go to Moab and stay there. Now, you've known this story since you were 5 years old. What happens when they get to Moab?
Well, the two sons married, then the husband dies, and then each of the sons.
Yeah, they figure they're going to be there for a while, so the sons get married. Moabites. Now, just pause a minute. They got married to foreigners. Now, pretend you don't know the end of the story. They go to Moab. They get married to foreign women. Is this going to be a good story?
They're gonna be in trouble.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know who else they were supposed to marry when they were living in Moab, but still.
Yeah, this is not going to be a good story. Like what you're thinking when you hear this story for the first time, assuming you're in the right period, you're thinking, oh, this is going to go badly, right? I mean, we know, like Proverbs told us to avoid the strange woman, that like avoid the foreign woman. That's never going to be a good story when you got Israelite men marrying foreign women. It's why everything went wrong with Solomon, married all those foreign women, right? This is not going to be a good story. That's what you're supposed to be thinking. We get a nice little surprise. Okay, so famine's over, and Naomi decides to go home. And you know the story. How's it go?
Ruth goes with us.
Yeah, Ruth goes with her.
Both daughters go first.
As far as the woman.
One man.
They start going, and then Orpah, she turns to her, and Naomi says, look, go back. I got nothing for you. I don't have a man, I don't have land, I've got nothing to offer you when I go back to my home. And Orpah, which by the way is related to name Oprah's name, apparently she was supposed to be named Orpah, but they misspelled it, so. If you were at the college, I would say your tuition dollars did not pay for that. So Orpah goes back to Moab, and Ruth makes this declaration that has become, like people know this, even if they don't know the story of Ruth. She makes a vow. What does she vow?
Where you go, I go, where you die, I die. She follows her.
Yeah, where you go, I will go.
And your people will be my people.
Your people will be my people.
Your God will be my God.
Your God will be my God. Where you are buried, I'll be buried. Okay, now just think about that for a minute. You've got some really important concept, kind of cultural things there. When we get married, don't we basically say to each other, your people will be my people? Like from now on, your family's my family. That's, wow, right? That's kind of a big commitment. Your people are my people. Your God is my God, right? She converts. Your land is my land. Where you go, I go, right? We sort of take our space with us. And then this one is fascinating to me. Where you are buried, I'll be buried. It's a big deal to convert to somebody else's culture, but to convert to the point where you adopt their burial practices, that's a really big deal. Try to imagine generations previous. Try to imagine 100 years ago. How would your great-grandparents have felt about cremation versus burial? I mean, how big of a deal was that?
Wouldn't approve of cremation.
Yeah.
My mother said that she hopes that my father dies before I do, because he would have a terrible time dealing with my cremation.
Yeah. Yeah. We were in Santa Fe one summer, and the way my mom does, she got in a conversation with an artist there. We were up in Abiquiu. No, we were at Santuario de Chimayo. Do y'all know that area? Well, now you need to know Santuario de Chimayo. And there's an artist there, and there had been fires, there had been wildfires. He had painted this amazing mountain with the kind of flames behind it. It's hanging in my dining room now. And they got in a conversation about the theology of burial practices. And he was worried that people might have been burned up in the fires and they wouldn't be able to get to them and get buried properly. And Mom said, oh, I'm planning to be cremated. And he's like, oh, he was worried about the resurrection. Would God be able to find all the parts of you for the resurrection? And Mom said, well, I think God can find me anywhere. And it has a fascinating theological conversation about burial versus cremation. Anyway, he gave her this painting, which is now in my dining room. And because I am who I am, I look at it and I think of the book of Ruth, right? Because Ruth adopts burial practices. Students have a hard time understanding why, like the young people, why would this be such a big deal? So there's this sect in India, the Parsi, who leave their dead for the vultures. The idea is that you are part of the food chain, right? And you come from nature and you return from nature, which there's a kind of beauty to it, but I'm not leaving my mom's body for the vultures either, right? I mean, when you think about burial practices, this is not a small vow. So here she is, this Moabite, this foreign woman, and she's showing this incredible display of faithfulness. So I'll live where you live, your people where you die, I die. Okay. So when, wild guesses, and it's not exile this time, wild guesses, when might a thing like this have been written? When would this matter? There's lots of possibilities. I mean, there's a right answer, but don't worry about that because there's lots of possibilities. When might something like this have been written?
Return from the exile when the land is populated by people that are not necessarily considered Hebrews or pure Hebrews.
Okay, so it could be returning from the exile. The land got repopulated by people who you wouldn't consider part of the chosen people. When you go back to the land, are you going to intermarry with them? Okay, that's one point where it could be important. When else might it be important?
So you told us the answer, but it's worth, it sits in here in between Judges and First Samuel, but you have to already know sort of who some of these people are before we get to them. I guess I think your Bible was someplace else. But if it was the DH who wrote all this other history, it would just be part of the history book. It wouldn't be its own thing. But yeah, you told us it was written at the same time as Ezra.
Yeah, okay. Just pretend I didn't tell you that already. Like, you're the only person in the room who remembers that, Daniel. I love that about Daniel, like, because I'll forget it. I'm like, can you remind me, what did I say? It's right there, steel trap. Yeah, okay, so but you can think, if this is part of the DH, which is the history that goes from the time you enter the promised land until you leave it, then that would be a point when, I mean, the DH is constantly telling people, don't intermarry. When you enter the land, stay separate. That's a constant theme in the DH. And now, right in the middle of the DH, right before we get to King David, who's the hero of the story, we get the story about this foreign woman who turns out to be his grandmother. That doesn't fit, right? No, the DH did not write this, no way, right? Clearly it's somebody who knows the story, who knows that King David is in the future, and who knows not just that King David's in the future, but who knows that 400 years later, people are still talking about David, right? Okay, so it could be exilic, like you could be thinking, all right, we're intermarrying with these Babylonian women, and if we're going to bring them back, how do they become part of the people? It could be post-exilic. Like there's lots of different periods in Israel's history where this could actually matter. It is post-exilic, but like I want you to see that there's a kind of logic here. That the DH is looking back through Israel's history and saying, do not marry foreign women, right? Which you do not tell people unless they're doing that, right? Like I've got a whole string of policies on my syllabus that exist because some student thought of something that I would never have imagined. Like, how could you interpret this assignment that way? But somebody did, and so now there's a policy on my syllabus that says don't do that, right? So you make rules telling people not to do stuff that people are doing. So throughout Israel's history, there's constantly intermingling with local populations, and there's constantly rules, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, all over the place, right? And here plopped into the middle of that narrative says, well, here's a way you could do that. Right? Here's a way in which you could incorporate a foreigner into Israel. It requires a very high degree of assimilation. So Ruth essentially has to renounce her own background in order to join the chosen people, but she can do it. And so this is a sort of a different pathway. It requires thinking about identity as Israel differently from thinking of your identity as genealogical, as what else? What it's different from what? Genealogical, different from what else?
Cultural.
Different. It's a It does actually still seem like a cultural definition, though, doesn't it? Because she has to. I mean, she has to agree. Okay, we'll go. I mean, it could be a cult. It could be saying being the people of God isn't just cultural. Okay, I have to come back and think about that one again. What else? To be Israel, not necessarily genealogy. Culture, I've got a question mark behind. What else? Doesn't have to be
Geographic.
Doesn't have to be geographical. I mean, they are going back to the land Israel, but clearly the people of exile thought that they were still Israel even when they weren't living in the land. So not necessarily the land. What else?
Not the tradition. Not the tradition.
Which tradition?
Well, the tradition of having to marry within Judaism.
Yeah, that it means there's malleability of traditions, including marriage traditions.
Religion.
Your God will be my God, right? It's clearly putting it as a religious identity, right? It's a community identity. Your people will be my people, your God will be my God. So it's a religious and community identity, but not necessarily a national identity, not necessarily a political identity, not necessarily an economic identity. So when you think about, like, in the US right now, where we have disputes about who's a real American, what are we arguing about? Like, who's a real American? How do you know? What exactly are we arguing about when we're trying to figure out who counts as a real American? You know the answer to this.
Do you accept all the thing, the rules, the Constitution and all that? I was just thinking about when someone becomes a citizen of the United States, they have to renounce, and it's only recently have we allowed, no, we still, yeah,
We don't.
allow dual citizenship.
Right.
That has been, you had to renounce your citizenship in another country.
Yeah. So part of what we say is,
Give up the
if you
other.
become American, you give up being something else. Okay. It's funny because on the other end, you don't have to renounce. So like Canada, you can be a Canadian and American citizen, but in America, you can only be an American citizen, but the Canadians don't care about that. They still think you're one of them. Anyway, your traditional always did not pick for that.
Here you don't have to renounce your religion, you keep your religion.
Okay, so here we say part of accepting our form of government is freedom of religion. Okay, what else are we arguing about? Like, what does it mean to be a real American?
Follow laws.
That you accept our laws?
Well, it's what is America? And other countries worry about this too, with, you know, if it's not just the same people who live in the same place forever. You know, like at what point does someone become
Yeah,
American or French or English or any of that?
yeah,
We work on speaking the language.
the language, what language do you speak, right? Yeah, we're asking, when are you legibly one of us? And that's more complicated than, did you stay here for the legal amount of time? Did you pass the test? Did you take the oath? Did you renounce citizenship elsewhere? Are you legibly one of us? Means, do you talk like we do? Do you value what we do? Do you look like we do? Do you have an accent when you speak? Do you, when we think about who counts as a real American, I have Asian friends who get asked, but where are you really from? Nobody ever asks me that, right? If I say I'm from Indiana, they're like, well, of course you're from Indiana, right? Whereas my Asian friends, if they say they're from Indiana, but they're like, but we're really, what they want to know is like, are you Indian ancestry? Are you Chinese? Nobody cares that I'm German ancestry, right? That doesn't matter because I'm legibly one of us. So when we're arguing about who we are, what we're having is a kind of cultural dispute about who gets to count, who gets to be an insider. And the author of the book of Ruth is making a bid for that. And the bid is you get to be Israel if, what? What are the non-negotiables? You get to be Israel if
One guy.
you have to believe in our God and just our God.
You accept our laws and our burial practices.
Yeah, so the burial practices is an interesting one because it's partly asking, this is why I've hesitated on yours, culturally, right? Do you accept our values? Now, that would partly be about the value of the body. The Hebrews are not dualistic. And so for them, we are our bodies, and burial practices are about respecting the body. And so it's asking, do you share our values around embodiment? Okay, do you share our religion? Do you share our values? What else?
Your people should be not equal, would that be tribal or?
Yeah, are you loyal to us? Right? It's a sense like, are you with us? Will you fight for us? Will you defend us? Are we really your people? Okay, so a sense of community.
And if you were to have children, they have to be, and even here, if you're an illegal alien and you have a child here.
Yeah.
That child is a citizen.
Yeah, if you have children, they're ours, right? That's part of the claim here. That when you become one of us, you're really one of us. And that includes that your kids are part of our lineage. And this is going to become really powerful because that's David, right? So this is making a claim, not actually a historical factual claim, but a story that says our great hero David doesn't have this pure lineage, right? That he comes from a foreign woman. That's an incredibly powerful thing to claim in this context, yeah.
In the Jewish tradition of the time, when Ruth married my only son,
Right.
did she have to make, was it expected in the Jewish tradition that she would make such a very similar pledge?
So the post-exilic period is a period where they're disputing whether it is even possible to become Jewish. So this isn't settled. It's not like, okay, well, here's our precedent and Ruth is following it. The author of Ruth is making the claim that you can marry in and become really one of us. They didn't know about DNA, but if they did, they would have said, you don't need the right DNA to be one of us. You need the right values. You need the right commitments. You need the right religion. That's what makes you one of us, not your ancestry.
Would it work the same way if it had been a man coming in and married an Israel, a woman from Israel? Or could a man never become an Israelite? I mean, a Hebrew.
Don't imagine that ancient societies are fundamentally different from ours. People have always found attraction and commitment and love across cultural differences. There's never been a time when that wasn't true. I don't have a particular case study, but it's impossible for me to believe that that wouldn't have been possible. Now, here's the deal. Because we're in a patriarchal society, the tradition would be that the woman becomes what the man is, not that the man would become what the woman he's marrying is. Does
There's
that-
no choice.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, but look what's being disputed, post-exilic period. These are hot debates about immigration, basically. It's, can an immigrant really become one of us? Or are you always held in suspicion? It's being written at about the same period as the book of Ezra. And of course, you remember at the end of the book of Ezra, all the people get together and they make a big decision about what to do with foreign women. All these men have married women who aren't from Israel. And the risk is that we're going to start worshiping foreign gods. We're going to end up in exile again. So they make a big decision about what they're going to do with these foreign women. Do you remember?
Get rid of them.
Send them away. They exile all of them, including their children. So now, did that ever happen? I don't know. It doesn't matter, right? The book of Ezra is being written to make this point that the most important thing is, I'm going to put this in a deliberately inflammatory way. The most important thing is racial purity. The most important thing is maintaining our lineage. The ancestry is what matters. You don't even get to come in unless you can produce the birth certificate. So the whole beginning of the book of Ezra is they're searching through the genealogical records, trying to prove that each person coming back has a lineage showing that they originally came from Israel. If they didn't, they're not allowed to come back, right? So the book of Ruth being written at the same time is, it's like op-ed pieces, right? Ezra said, you can't be one of us if you didn't originally come from here. You can't immigrate. You can't convert. The book of Ruth is saying you can, because our identity isn't about ancestry. Our identity isn't as a political unit. Our identity isn't as an economic unit. Our identity is a religious unit. That's really only possible post-exilic, because exile is the first period in which they ever had to test. What if you don't have your land? What if you don't have your king? Right? What if you don't have all those things that you could say, I was born here, of course I'm American, I mean Israelite, right? So if you can maintain an identity in exile and it becomes a movable identity where you don't have to go to Jerusalem, then you can take what's now, we're kind of going through the period where we would say Judah to saying Jewish, right? Now you can take your Jewish identity and go anywhere with it and still be Jewish, because being Jewish is about having those right commitments. The test case is this woman who married in, right? Okay, so Ruth comes back, and now we're gonna go back to the story about Tamar. Because you remember Tamar, husband died. Her father-in-law Judah is supposed to tell the next son to marry her, but Onan doesn't do right by her. So the next one, and Judah forgets that he has this obligation to Tamar. And she's trying to claim the next kinsman is owed to me in marriage. And if I have to disguise myself as a prostitute and have a baby by my own father-in-law, I'm gonna get what's owed me. Ick, but, right? I mean, you get what, like, she's making her claim. So Naomi, this is not Naomi bringing her son and his wife back. The son is gone. Now the question is she really one of us in the sense of being owed? Is she owed a Jewish family, right? Does the next in line owe her something? That's a big claim, right? Okay, so they come back, and Naomi has this kinsman, and the question is, can you get the kinsman to do his duty?
Very helpful if the plot reasons Ruth doesn't have any kids and Boaz is single enough.
Boaz is available. Like, I don't know, every time I hear the story, I remember when my cousin's kid was about 3 years old, they heard 3 or 4, they heard the story in Sunday school, not like we're telling it. And she called him Bojazz. Like for the rest of my life, I think of this guy's Bojazz. All right, Bojazz. So Ruth is going and working in the fields. They got to convince Bojazz that he should take her as next of kin. So here we are in chapter 3. The footnotes say that this is not one of those instances where feet means genitals, but I'm gonna, like, let's just look at it and you draw your own judgment. I know what mine is. This is chapter 3. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it will be well with you. Now here's our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you've been working. See, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes. And go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he'll tell you what to do." And she said to her, "I'll do all that you've told me." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law has instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I'm Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." Okay, what did she just ask him for? Yeah. Yeah, she just asked him for his obligation as next of kin.
She used the magic words, for you are next of kin.
That's right. You are next of kin. It's not just like, "Hey, Bojazz, I think you're an attractive guy," right? It's this is the key that unlocks the relationship. You're next of kin. You have this moral obligation to me. And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask." And so he says, "Oh, but hang on, I just remembered there's somebody who's related to you more closely than I am. Stay tonight. If he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do it. If he's not willing to act as next of kin for you, then as Yahweh lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize another, for he said, it must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And then he said, bring the cloak you're wearing and hold it out. And so he fills it with barley. When I ask my students what's going on there, where she stays overnight but then leaves before people can tell who she is, they call it the walk of shame. And I'm a little horrified. Like, there are things I don't want to know about my students. So anyway, what you see there, this now is coming back to the same questions about concentrations of wealth, who has the claim on the identity of Israel, and then it's connected again to this status of women in Israel. Plus, Ruth is just a really, really fun story, and it's got this nice little bombshell at the end. Ha ha! This is David's grandmother, and so if you think David wasn't a real Israelite, then it's kind of like the slam dunk argument about whether you can become part of the community by marrying in. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.